Hey there, healthcare humans. I want to invite you to sign up for my course,
I'm a Canadian
How to Stop
family
Worrying
physician
About Your Patients,
who also
it's a
works
free
as a
5-day
restorative
email course
medical
delivered right to your
educator,
inbox,
facilitator,
where I
and
teach
coach.
you why
I
worrying
create
is
spaces
optional,
that rehumanize
that it's not
the
actually
work of
helpful for your
healthcare.
patients, and that it's
I'm creating
possible
this
to reclaim your
podcast
brain
to remind
from worry
myself,
and start enjoying your life in
else
and outside
working
of
in the
medicine.
helping profession.
Go to
That when you are working and caring
joanchanmd.com/course
for
to
your
sign up
human
now.
patients,
I'll see you in your inbox.
you are the other human in the room.
Hello, healthcare humans. Thank you so much for coming back for another episode of The Other Human in the
I want to
Room.
invite you to sign up for my
It's
course,
another episode
How to
of
Stop
The Only
Worrying
Human
About Your
in This
Patients.
Van.
It's a
in
free
the sense that, as
5-day
you can't
email
tell
course
from
delivered right to your inbox.
my heaters
where
blasting
I
and my
teach
turn
you
signal
why
ticking,
worrying is
I am
optional,
driving to work.
that it's not actually helpful for your patients, and that
I've
it's
had
possible
this
to reclaim your
idea
brain from worry
for a topic
and start
to talk
enjoying
about on
your
the
life in
podcast
and
for
outside
some
of medicine.
time.
Go to
And then recently I've had
joanchanmd.com/course to sign up now. I'll see you in your inbox.
Newer clients that have really kind of brought this idea to a head in my mind, and I need to talk about it. It needs to come out of me. And so I'm calling the idea guideline legalism. And so I should probably just give a backstory about, well, I guess first I'll describe what it is that I'm seeing that I think I want to call guideline legalism. So I've been having conversations with some folks, some people that are new clients for me. And one of the themes that a lot of people are feeling really down about, and that often then feeds sort of imposter syndrome, is the judgment of others, colleagues. In some cases, these are residents, and it's their preceptors, people who are transitioning, back from maternity leave or other kinds of medical leave. And like, one of the things that really feeds their imposter syndrome is when other colleagues are like, don't you know that that's definitely not how you practice medicine? And like, don't you know, like, that's like really inappropriate care? Or like specialists being like, this family doctor didn't provide the right kind of care. And then probably family doctor saying this specialist doesn't know what they're talking about. Like, it's a lot of that going around, and sometimes it's explicit, like people really just criticizing each other and saying like, don't they know that the guidelines have changed? Or don't they know that that's not what anyone's doing anymore? Don't they know that that's not the evidence-based way of doing things? I experienced that. I was giving a talk for like a larger audience of family physicians, and it was a talk that was just about like practical tips that family physicians like myself can use to try and manage the very, very large, excessive as in like more patients wanting care because of all the viral respiratory illness that's been going around, right? And so it's like, how do you deal with this much escalated volume when you still are just one person and you're one team, and you actually just don't have enough spots to see every single person who has a fever and a cough? This past fall, certainly, and even now it's slowed down a bit, but there was a time where it was really just so ramping up. And one of the ideas that I wanted to share, the notion of my talk was just me giving my practical tips, like the things that help me, the things that help me manage the volume, manage the time. And one of the things I wanted to offer was that I do on occasion, and depending on the day, lots versus little, offer people conditional prescriptions. I actually use that technique a lot. Like, here's a medication, here's an antibiotic. If the symptoms don't go away in blah blah days, then probably you need it. Or I use it even for not just antibiotics, but other kinds of things, especially like when it's a Friday, and you're like, listen, Murphy's Law is, I swear I'm not superstitious, but if I don't give you this prescription for this medication, you will need it. If this pain doesn't go away, here's an anti-inflammatory you can use if you need it, or whatever, a conditional prescription. And the people organizing the talk were like, oh, well, you can't say that because that's not evidence-based. And just the thing that was interesting to me about that piece of the conversation versus the rest of the conversation is that the rest of what I was going to offer was also not evidence-based. Like, the entire talk was anecdotal. Like, the entire talk was me being like, hey, here's what works for me. And this was one of the things. But and this isn't a criticism of those folks in particular. I actually quite admire the folks who organize these talks. It's more about, because it was actually not even necessarily these people that, like, this was their opinion. They were like concerned about what other people would say. And it's sort of like, we as an organization need to present ourselves as evidence-based and following what the latest evidence, the latest guidelines are, right? Otherwise people will criticize us or will be viewed as less legitimate and like all this stuff. And I mean, this is the same thing as what I was describing that my clients have been through when, like, a specialist is like, don't you know that the latest guidelines say something different? Or someone has a locum and the locum says, don't you know that the latest guidelines say something different? Or you are a locum and the person you're working for, like, all of this criticizing each other, how each other practice medicine in this way of like, don't you know that this is the right way and you're doing it wrong? And sometimes that's explicit, where like, you're doing it wrong. And sometimes they really are just saying, I do it a different way. And then because we're so primed to think that everything we're doing wrong, then we like take it that way. Like, some of this is internalized as well. So I'm calling this whole phenomenon, in what I've just described and talking about it, what we do to each other in relationship to this phenomenon. But like, the worst culprit for this thing I'm calling guideline legalism, we do internally, we do to ourselves, because we've been conditioned to do it by everyone who's, told it to us. But I see it manifest as a lack of clinical confidence, increased anxiety and worry about your worth, that's your imposter syndrome, all this stuff. And when it's internalized like that, the way it often looks is constantly checking with other people. Hey, how do you do this thing? What do you do? Am I following the right guidelines? I just want to make sure I'm doing it the most up to date. When I have this kind of specific case, is there a guideline for that? Can you point me to a resource that shows me the ABC step of how to manage when someone comes in with toe pain and earlobe pain and one nostril drips every other Tuesday? Like, there must be a guideline for that, right? And I'm exaggerating, but that's how I think it manifests when it's not someone else criticizing us, but it's actually us trying to avoid being judged and criticized for this thing. And this thing is guideline legalism. So now I'm going to define what the heck I'm talking about. So I think we all know what I mean by guidelines, and whether it's literally a guideline or sort of a norm in medicine, or at least a thing that some expert or body of experts is positing as the norm that all other clinicians should adopt, right? So it's this set of guidelines. And by the way, right there in the name of it, I mean, a guideline, you could think of it as, the lines on the road or a guide rail, right? So something where if you do something way off of what this says, you might be way off track. You might be now straying into dangerous territory where you're practicing medicine in a way that harms people or something, right? That's kind of, I think, why guidelines started to exist is, I have not done a deep dive into the history of guidelines. If someone has, please correct. I'd actually be interested in where they emerged, because like, I can understand the notion, each of us practicing medicine and just trying to figure out what the heck we're doing. It's nice to have like a set of recommendations that you can kind of check. Am I following these? Then I feel okay, right? Like, that's, I think, what we think of when we think of guidelines. And then there's the word legalism. So legalism is a word that I learned and I think is really mostly just used in the context of religion. So a little like quick personal backstory on me is I was raised in a pretty fundamentalist, like pretty rigid like version of evangelical Christianity. And this won't be the podcast where I like totally deconstruct what that particular form of religion did to my brain in my life. But I no longer practice, and I'm no longer identify as that particular religion. And one of the terms that was talked about a lot is this term legalism, which I'm going to say my definition, that maybe a theologian would disagree, but legalism in that context is sort of people who take the Bible and they try and like follow it to the letter. So it's like, okay, but in Corinthians chapter 2 verse 3 says this, and that means you can never ever ever do this thing. And then they'll have a debate like, well, did it mean this? But what if it meant that, right? Like, are you allowed to covet your neighbor's wife every other week? Does covet mean you have a stray thought about them? You know what I mean? Like, and I'm kind of teasing, but like literally there's probably a whole book about what it means to cover your neighbor's wife. Like, people can get really like in debates about basically what are the rules, what is good and what is bad, in very like clear terms. So it's like, you know, if you kiss someone who's not your partner one time, then you're out, you know, or like whatever. If you lie one time, then you're out of the club, or you know, going to hell or whatever, right? Like very rigid and very focused on rules and on using rules to judge who is good and who is bad, and you know, way less emphasis on say like forgiveness, but really emphasizing the stuff that, you know, the stuff that you do that you want to judge, does the person even deserve forgiveness, or are they actually just too terrible to deserve forgiveness, right? And I really think the same kind of thing is happening in the medical world, and we've turned these guidelines into like a kind of Bible, and not even like, this isn't slamming the Bible. I think people can use the Bible for inspiration in wonderful ways that have nothing to do about judging each other and judging ourselves. And just in the same way, like, I'm sure there's versions of using the guidelines where you're just like, you know, I just like am curious what other people do, and will that fit me and how I practice, and I'm going to take what makes sense for me out of this, and then other stuff I'm going to kind of throw away, because it says here it's only level C expert opinion evidence anyway. So obviously this expert's opinion doesn't have to be lauded over my own. It's basically just a suggestion, right? Versus, yeah, maybe if something's level A evidence and has solid trials that this medicine versus that medicine seems to have greater benefit, okay, so I'm going to use this guideline to remind me this ACE inhibitor has superior evidence to some other drug, you know? Like, you see how that way of using guidelines is still trusting and centering your own experience, your own expertise through experience and knowledge, right? But you're not using it to guide whether you're a good clinician or not. And that's what I mean by guideline legalism. And I see it all the time. Like, people will like say like, oh, you know, that doctor isn't even prescribing blah, 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 or that doctor still is prescribing this other thing. And, you know, I am not saying that there's no room for calling out or calling in clinicians who are practicing in dangerous ways. For sure, that's a good idea. But it's like not that. It's not like, wow, you're causing harm. It's just like, oh, you don't see your diabetics every 3 months, but the guidelines say you should. And it's, you know, actually, like, that's a really good one. We're at least where I live in my province, we're incentivized to see people who have diabetes every 3 months, because we get like, you know, financial bonuses for it. And so then we kind of get conditioned to believe you're only a good doctor if you're seeing your diabetes patients every 3 months. But it's like good to question, like, did the studies test what happens if you see people with diabetes every 5 months, every 6 months? And is it like really that their diabetic control just really falls off a cliff if you don't see them as often? I'm laughing at myself, because I know obviously, well, not obviously, maybe, but because of the pandemic, I was like quite rigid before about trying to get all my people with diabetes in, and had doing lots of reminder calls and kind of that babysitter style medicine, because I thought like, this is how I prove I'm a good doctor. We get this practice report about like how many of our patients who have diabetes haven't had an A1C in the last 6 months, and like I would view the people that were on that list as like my personal failing. see, this is something that's telling me I'm not getting an A+ in diabetic management. This report told me. And so I'm like trying to force people to come in who are like, I don't even care that I have diabetes. And I'd be like, oh no, this means I'm a bad clinician. If someone found out about it, they would judge me as a bad clinician, you know? And then there are times where, you know, I hear of or have experienced in the past people coming up and being like, oh, you know, Joan, I noticed that you don't always offer everyone with diabetes a statin. And I'm like, what's going on there? Like, don't you know that it's guidelines that everyone with diabetes is on a statin? And like, it's like this subtle kind of judgment. Like, it doesn't have to be like, wow, you're bad. But it's like, oh, I think I'm helping you because I'm telling you that you're not following the rules correctly. That's actually the most sinister kind of legalism. And I mean, I experienced it a ton in the religious world of like, oh, I don't know if you know, but like, listening to that band is secular. That band is not Christian. Sorry if that's triggering for people who've had the same upbringing as me, but it's like this subtle, like, trying to help you. Did you know that you're actually being a bad person? I think you didn't. So I'm going to tell you in this manner. And by the way, if you have been this person and now you're like, excuse me, I was just trying to help them, I hear you. I have been you as well. Like I said, I was a very good, well, I didn't say this, but I was like an awesome evangelical Christian. I converted a lot of my friends to Christianity in high school, thank you very much. And that included a lot of like, did you know that this is sin? You know? So I cringe because I know what it's like to be like, oh, I'm sure you just weren't aware that the latest guidelines actually say that that's all wrong, and therefore I'm not saying you should feel terrible for being a totally negligent physician. Like the kind of know-it-all attitude. I am a recovering know-it-all. I'm a recovering, you know, guideline legalism, you know, police other people a little bit in order to feel superior person. So, hey, if you're one of those, I'm with you. I've been you. And the thing I've noticed about when I've done it to myself, so when I've gotten so anxious and so critical of myself, like, oh my gosh, I hadn't even heard of this new medicine. What's wrong with me? Now I'm so behind. Now I'm such a failure as a clinician. What? There's a whole new set of guidelines for blah, blah, blah. And they've been out for years and I had no idea. Oh my gosh, I'm an incompetent doctor. Like, you see how we use these as like standards? And we use it as standards of if you're good or bad? That's what I'm talking about when I say legalism. It's so not useful. So like all of that, like I said, that's the inhuman story. Basically, the inhuman story to boil down is if you don't follow some random guideline, that means you're not a good enough clinician to exist. I don't know. You should feel bad about yourself. Like that's the inhuman story. And we feel guilt and shame and anxiety and feel like we have to keep up with all the journals and all the guidelines. And it's not from a place of like, I wonder if there's new evidence of things that could like help my patients more, which I think that's a nice way to think about keeping up with the evidence. Lifelong learning is not lifelong learning in order to maybe someday finally feel like you know enough to feel good about yourself. But instead, like, oh, have there been new advancements in medicine that like could make my job easier or make my patients' lives better? I'll read a journal for that, right? And so that's the inhuman story, is that like what we know and which guidelines we follow, and if we're the perfect rule followers and we counsel every single patient on ABC, you know, drug interaction. And I'm not saying it's not, listen, it's nice to counsel patients. It's nice to know interactions, but it's like doing it from this place of like, if I forget one single detail of my perfectly curated stamp that has all the different guidelines in it, then I will have failed this visit. That's where I think we've lost the plot a little bit. Because here's the thing. The truth is, like the healing human story I'm going to offer you is something I have said pretty much to every single one of my coaching clients. And I say to my colleagues all the time, they're probably annoyed at me. Medicine is heterogeneous, like period. And it always will be. Like each human who practices medicine practices it in a slightly different way. And not just in their like communication style, but in their clinical decisions. And I think there's some people who think that's a bad thing, but diversity is always a good thing. I think it is wise to have not guidelines, but more rules of naming what is harmful to patients. Like, I'm glad there's, pretty strong like rules or guidelines that saying, I don't know, conversion therapy for people who are in the LGBTQ community, aka like therapy that's trying to convert them out of their genuine sexuality, like that's like definitely super harmful. I'm glad that rule exists and it has good evidence behind it. And like, yeah, let's make sure we're not using our position of power in medicine to harm people. Those sorts of guidelines are great. But when we then twist it around to say, listen, a group of, experts in a field, as well as pharmaceutical companies and some other random people, got in a room and decided this medicine is best and this dose is best and this is how often you should see people and this is how often you should repeat the test. Like, that is not then the standard of if you are a good doctor or not. That is a potentially, and not always, helpful suggestion list that you can now use your brilliant, experienced expert brain to decide if it applies to A, how you practice medicine, and B, if it applies to the patient in front of you. That's the most important thing. Like, even if someone could give me an argument about how it could be a good idea that most clinicians would be working basically from the same set of guidelines. So there's like some uniformity. You see one doctor, they're generally going to give you the same spiel and the same menu of treatment than another one. Like, I can see that that's pretty valid. But that doesn't mean we're all going to now practice the same way, prescribe medicine at the same rate, have the same outcomes, because our patients are diverse. And it's really harmful for patients if we think we have to like whip them into shape so that they fit the guideline cookie cutter. That for sure is not helpful, because each human is unique. That's one of the main ways that evidence-based medicine can accidentally cause harm is like, well, like you try and choose your study population correctly, but a lot of times like there's certain studies that are used widely for all populations that were really just like upper middle class white males. And it's like, well, then everyone should be on this medicine because upper middle class white males in this one study, it helped them. That can really hurt people that were like, that doesn't apply to them. And there's factors there that make that, regimen of treatment or that medication or whatever, actually it like literally won't work the same way in their body, or it's, certainly harmful to suggest that approach based on their social context. Like, there's so many ways that we have to make sure we're checking. Is the evidence, are the guidelines that I'm suggesting even applicable to this particular patient, right? This particular population, to my particular country, or my, that's it's very, colonial, very supremacist to say that every single clinician across the world should all be practicing one way. For the reasons I just listed. It also totally robs each clinician of trust in their own clinical intuition and trusting that they have a good sense of medicine, a good sense of their knowledge base, as well as their experience with people in general and this person in particular, and saying none of that matters. You just got to try and force them onto a statin. You can tell I have a problem with statins. Listen, they have their place, but their place in the guidelines, I'm not sure about them. So yes. Okay. Whew, I feel like am I out of steam? Maybe I'm out of steam. I'm almost at my office. You'll hear me pulling into my parking garage and the beep of my the turnstile soon. I feel so strongly about this because it's such a major component about why people, they call it imposter syndrome, but I think it's really this, is they're feeling the detrimental effects of guideline legalism, like for real. So can we stop doing this to ourselves, to each other? Like, what if, starting with yourself, right? If you're someone who finds that you often have kind of judgmental thoughts, if you've listened to this and are going, ouch, 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 I think I am like a guidelines legalistic person, and I'm always trying to help people and inform them in a way that now I realize probably makes my fellow clinicians feel really judged. Oh no. The way it starts is with yourself. And in fact, so say you have a person like that in your life, please know that underneath, the reason that they feel so compelled to tell you, but these are all the rules, and why aren't you following the rules, and don't you think you should follow the rules, and isn't everyone following these rules, is because they think internally this totally toxic, horrible lie, which is that we are all supposed to have this completely uniform, context blind approach to medicine. And they're ignoring just the fact that medicine is heterogeneous and is diverse, right? How we practice medicine is diverse, and that is to be celebrated. Because what happens when you let go of guideline legalism, or you let guidelines literally be suggestions, but you always center yourself and your trust in your own clinical, brilliant brain, is, first of all, you get your joy back because you don't have to triple check everything you do against an external standard. You can check a reference, right? But it's still centering like, this is what I know. I want to see, do other people do it this way? Oh, this person does do it the same way as me, and this guideline says no. Interesting. I think in this case, I'm still going to go with what I'm doing. Like, do you see how you can still check outside of yourself, but you're not abandoning yourself and trust in yourself. You can trust that you, as you are now, know a ton, and the care you're providing is amazing. Like, I have clients who are literally caring for so many people who are thanking them, people who are so grateful for their care, not exclusively, also people complain, but like, who are offering like amazing care at this time where like we really need people to offer care to other people. And then they're totally beating the crap out of themselves about it because it's not good enough, because it's not to the norm, because now they feel like they don't belong. Now they feel like other people are judging them. And it's just so sad. Why are we doing this to each other? And it's because we're doing it to ourselves. So anyone who feels the need to judge others is really harshly judging themselves. And so if you are there judging yourself, here's what you can do. You can remind yourself, okay, well, Joan said that I'm allowed to have a difference of opinion from anyone else. What if I was like a fully confident clinician? Like, one question I used to ask myself, it was kind of a little trick. I'd be like, oh, I don't know, is this the right or wrong thing? Will everyone judge me? And then I just asked myself, Joan, what would a confident clinician do in this case? If you did already believe in yourself completely and just trust that whatever your brain offers is like solid. I also like solid choice versus like good or bad. It's just like a solid choice. It's not like totally off the rails. It's not like intending to murder anyone. It's intending to help. Whether it does or not, it's a solid choice, one of many. What do you want to choose? And then I would choose that thing. And then I wouldn't feel confident. I'd still have all of this internalized like anxiety and beating myself up for all the rules, but I just like choose based on what I imagine. If I did feel confident, I would probably decide. And I would do that. And I would do that more and more. And doing that then allowed me to step into my confidence, like pretending to believe in myself and then acting that out and seeing that it went fine. It was still great. Very rarely would things not, go terribly wrong. And they were, very rarely going terribly wrong before when I didn't trust myself at all. Maybe it has nothing to do with me, Doing that process of like every time I'd be like questioning, just pausing. Okay, I know. Oh, it sounds like I've got a lot of guideline legalism going on in here. I'm just like really spinning about all these guidelines. What if this guideline doesn't know me and my patients as well as me? What if I pretend to be confident, make a decision, see what happens? Over time, it really does improve my confidence, because confidence is self-trust. That's the definition I like better than the word confident. And the practice of self-trust, trusting myself to just make the choice despite all the noise, over time, it builds that muscle so that you do start to no longer need to view guidelines as if they are the word of God. Instead, you can use guidelines of what they are, which is like a very imperfect, often quite biased, occasionally helpful framework that you can decide when it does and does not apply to the patient sitting in front of you and the brilliant clinical brain that you have. That's how I view guidelines now. I don't think they're bad. but I think they can be used in a way that's very bad, as in very harmful, right? And so that felt good. I hope that helps somebody. I see it often enough that I think it's like a common theme. And man, like for our sweet like medical learners, I know you got to study something on the exam, but then I mean that can cause so much dissonance when you're like, this is what the exam says to do as the ultimate right answer of all choices, but in practice everyone's doing different things. And I kind of just, for them, I just named like, that's correct. So obviously on the exam they're going to only have one right answer, because that's sort of the premise of exams, and until they figure out another way to do it, that's how they're going to do it. But out in practice, you just get to decide. You get to decide with each person what makes sense. What makes sense to my brain, considering this person's context. Which guideline do I want to try and apply or not, based on what's in the room? Not having the outside world dictate what happens in the room, but having what's in the room always take priority. That's like the ultimate work that I'm hoping I'm helping people to do, because it's you and this human is sitting in front of you. You two know better than any other expert out there what will work right here and now. And so the guidelines are there to support that, or they go in the trash. Okay? All right. I really hope that helps someone. It helped me to say it to myself. I hope you have a good day. Bye.
Hey there, healthcare humans. I want to invite you to sign up for my course, How to Stop Worrying About Your Patients. It's a free 5-day email course delivered right to your inbox, where I teach you why worrying is optional, that it's not actually helpful for your patients, and that it's possible to reclaim your brain from worry and start enjoying your life in and outside of medicine. Go to joanchanmd.com/course to sign up now. I'll see you in your inbox.